They've never been close, but now Russia's decision to grant asylum to Edward Snowden is opening old wounds with Washington. Barack Obama has cancelled a meeting with Vladimir Putin, saying it's time to reassess the relationship. Could it be the start of a 21st century Cold War? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Relations between the US and Russia have hit a new low, with Barack Obama saying openly that their partnership just isn't working. Washington is still fuming at Russia's decision to grant asylum to US whistleblower Edward Snowden. And now Obama has pulled out of talks with Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the G20 summit.
I think the latest episode is just one more in a number of emerging differences that we've seen over the last several months around Syria, around human rights issues, where it is probably appropriate for us to take a pause, reassess where it is that Russia's going, what our core interests are, and calibrate the relationship so that we're doing things that are good for the United States and hopefully good for Russia as well, but recognizing that there are just going to be some differences and we're not going to be able to completely disguise them.
Edward Snowden may have been the catalyst, but Obama and Putin have never been close. Patty Culhane reports from Washington.
I mean, look at this picture here.
This is what the U.S.-Russian relationship has come down to.
So what is going on?
U.S. President Barack Obama laughing about his frosty relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin on a late-night comedy show.
And Putin seems to me like one of those old-school KGB guys.
Well, he headed up the KGB.
Yeah, well, that's right. What I mean. Yeah.
And now Obama's going to Sweden and not Moscow, canceling his planned summit with the Russian president, describing the tensions as basically Putin's fault.
But there have been times where they slip back into Cold War thinking and a Cold War mentality. And what I consistently say to them and what I say to President Putin is that's the past. And we've got to think about the future.
U.S. officials admit it's mostly because of Edward Snowden, the man who told the world about U.S. spying, granted asylum in Russia. But they insist it's also because of fights over Syria, missile defense, and human rights. The Russians call the decision disappointing. It's a new low for a relationship the Obama administration had said was critical to reset, even using a prop to prove the point at the beginning of his first term.
This says перегрузка, which means overcharge.
President Obama said it would improve in a second, even though he didn't know he could be heard saying this.
This is my last election. Yeah. After my election, I have more flexibility.
Flexibility the U.S. is no longer willing to show, according to analyst Andrew Kuchins.
The administration was not getting a response from the Russians that they were ready to deal.
President Obama will travel to Russia for the G20, even if he'll refuse to meet with its host, a sign that despite diplomatic slaps and scrapes, the two countries will almost certainly have to continue working together over the long term, even if they just don't seem happy about it. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our guests now. In London, James Nixie is head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. And in Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a political analyst and writer for Russia Profile magazine. Good to have you both with us. Let's go to Russia first to get the perspective from there. Dmitry, is this what we're looking at, another Cold War?
No, I don't think so, because objectively there are no reasons for a new Cold War. And I just don't buy it that Mr. Putin is an anti-Western president. I don't believe the stories about tens of thousands of Russian weapons for Syria. I think if there were any supplies, there were very small ones. And besides that, give me an example of a real anti-Western action that Mr. Putin has done during his 12 years in office, actually. He acquiesced to the expansion of NATO and the EU. He allowed America to have its bases in Central Asia. He helped Americans in Afghanistan. So I don't see objective reasons for a confrontation.
Because
I
Obama
think
is saying
all
that
these
Russia has
issues
slipped
that Mr.
back
Obama
into a
said,
Cold War mentality. What's he referring to there?
well, that's what I wanted to say. I think that, you know, these so-called human rights issues that he talks about, these are actually media creations. If you follow what was said, you know, all of the scandals that were made during the last 2 years, you will see that almost none of the fears that Western media had about Russia ever realized. There is always a big scandal when some new law is passed in Russia or some tough statement is made. But then people forget after that hysteria that actually nothing comes out of it. Just 6 months ago, all the Western media was awash with reports about this new NGO law. The media said that all of the NGOs are going to shut down. Now 6 months have passed. Not a single NGO stopped operations.
Okay, you've
But
raised
the
a few
Western media does
things,
not
but you
report
called, you mentioned this so-called human rights issues. Let me just put something to you. This is according to Human Rights Watch. They say the Russian government has unleashed a crackdown on civil society unprecedented in the country's post-Soviet history. They talk about creeping authoritarianism, undermining democracy and rule of law in Russia.
Well, I mean, give me concrete examples. You can write about crackdowns, you can say that this is unprecedented. Just where are the concrete facts? You know, the problem is that all of these are media-created phenomena.
Okay, let me put that to James, because you are certainly mentioning a lot of things. Do you agree with that, James? Lots of issues, obviously, but let's stick to the human rights one for the moment. I mean, is this just a media problem?
Sure, let's stick to the human rights one. No. Russia is a deeply undemocratic and authoritarian and illiberal regime. And since Mr. Babic would like some examples, let me supply a couple. What do you need for a democracy? You need free and fair elections. No, Russia doesn't have them. It rigs its elections. You need a free press. Russia does not have a free press, particularly in its televisual media. And finally, you need a separation of powers between the courts and the state, between the executive and the legislature. And Russia does not have that either. Those are the three things, or three of the things, that you need for a democracy. And that is why Russia has such an abysmal human rights record. And that is why Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and all those other advocacy organizations take a particularly strong line. In its defense, Russia will say, well, we are no better than, or no worse rather, than Saudi Arabia, than China. And that is absolutely true. And it is also absolutely true that the West has double standards. But that doesn't abrogate Russia. Russia is still guilty of those facts that I mentioned earlier. The fact that other people are guilty and the fact that the West has double standards towards these other countries is irrelevant insofar as it doesn't diminish Russia's overall responsibility. So there are very concrete examples of an illiberal, undemocratic and human rights ignoring Russia. I do agree with Mr. Babic, however, on the Cold War issue. I genuinely believe there is not a new Cold War. And that is because it's not possible. Russia lost the Cold War, and so it's over. And it lost it because technologically, culturally, militarily, and economically, it couldn't measure up.
So are you saying because they're not equal partners from a power and economic point of view, you can't...
They're not even remotely equal partners. Russia is 2% of the world economy. So you can't be equal partners like that.
So do you think it's time now for the US to stop viewing Russia with such importance, as having such relevance as it does?
It already does. If you speak to the politicians on Capitol Hill, they will actually tell you they've got more important things to worry about. Russia is useful to America only insofar as it is a hindrance on other matters, on other foreign policy matters. But trade is minimal. Relations are frosty. Usefulness and parity is simply not there. So actually, that's already happened. In other words, this discussion could have happened a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, really.
But, you know, the rift that we've been talking about could have major implications for Syria, where the only hope for diplomatic breakthrough has come down to Russia and the US. Both sides say they're still committed to the process in spite of their recent differences.
Syria is indeed at the top of our agenda. Our goal is the same. We need to start a political process and stage the Geneva II conference. In my mind, the most important thing for Geneva II would be to honour all the commitments of G8 leaders made in Loch Erne when they called on the government and opposition to fight terrorists.
And one thing I would emphasize is that on Syria, while Sergei and I do not always agree completely on responsibility for the bloodshed or on some of the ways forward, both of us and our countries agree that to avoid institutional collapse and descent into chaos, the ultimate answer is a negotiated political solution.
Dmitry, if the two main players here have such opposing views, what hope then for Syria?
Well, I don't think that Russia and the US indeed have conflicting interests in Syria, because after all, the ultimate interest of Russia and ultimate interest of the US is not to allow radicals, Islamist militants, to come to power in Damascus. I think it becomes clear now.
Well, there's one already in power in Damascus, isn't there?
Well, I agree with James that Russia may not be a very important partner for the United States. Most of our trade is with the European Union. I think the main reason is politics. You know, we have very bad history behind us. But I think that Russia is badly needed by the West, for example, in Syria, in order to justify the West's own miscalculations. The West miscalculated in Syria. They expected Assad's regime to fall in a matter of weeks or months. It didn't. That was a huge miscalculation. And instead of fighting the experts who gave them wrong advice, the United States and the West blame it on Russia. They say that Russia and Iran supply arms to the Syrian regime,
but
and
Russia
that's why
does.
that regime is still in place. If you look at the map, you can see that it's impossible to organize large-scale supplies because there is Turkey and the European Union between Russia and Syria.
But is that true, James? I mean, Russia is
arms.
behind supplying large weapons to Syria.
Russia is both right and wrong on Syria. It is entirely correct to say that one should be very skeptical about any kind of intervention, because we simply don't know what would happen afterwards, the bloodshed it would cause and the aftermath. We don't know. And in that sense, I genuinely understand Russia's argument. However, Russia undermines its own argument with its supplying of weapons to the government side. So Russia claims a human rights angle, but then supplies weapons which the Syrian government uses against its own people. The Russian argument would be much more convincing if it were not to do that. So I think that it's all very well to talk about we need to have negotiations, we need diplomacy to settle this, but actually people are being killed. There's an enormous loss of life in Syria, and that seems to leave the Russians unmoved. It doesn't leave the West unmoved, and that's a critical difference.
James,
so
is Russia not key at forcing Assad's hand, though?
There has been no evidence of a way in which Russia has managed to limit President Assad's actions so far. It has claimed that it has tried to do so, but the facts on the ground suggest that people are dying each and every single day. The old saying that for evil to flourish, good men only have to do nothing is precisely what is occurring. We are doing nothing. Now, the question is would more lives be lost if we intervene, or would more lives be lost if we don't intervene? And that is unknowable. And as I say, in that respect, I do understand Russia's argument. But Russia's argument has a different motive. Russia is intrinsically pro-sovereignty, the inviolability of the nation state, whereas the West has a sort of a liberal interventionism attitude. And these two things fundamentally conflict. So whilst I sympathize with the Russian argument that we should not blindly rush into Syria in order on some mission, because we don't know what the consequences are, and we've seen appalling consequences of that kind of interventionism in other states in the Middle East, then I feel that Russia undermines its own argument with its hypocrisy.
Okay. Dmitry, do you think what hardens this standoff, this difference of opinion between Russia and the US, is the fact that Russia does have an ally in Syria, that Russia is still smarting over US intervention in Libya?
Well, I think that basically if you look at what happened, it's quite clear that the Western powers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also Turkey, supplied a lot more weapons to the Syrian rebels than Russia or Iran supplied to the Syrian government. There are lots of stories about that in the Western press. And I think that certainly Russia was not happy about what happened in Libya, because it was a direct intervention. and the consequences are very bad. The American ambassador in Libya was murdered after that so-called revolution, so-called democratic revolution. So I don't know who is the hypocrite here, because read yesterday's New York Times. You will see that, you will read there that actually the opposition guys in Syria are organizing mass executions. They are introducing Sharia laws in the areas that they control. There is almost no conflict between the so-called Free Syrian Army and the Islamist insurgents who came to Syria from Iraq. And I would say that the United States is very forgetful, because the people who are fighting the Syrian government in Syria are the same people who have been killing American soldiers in Iraq just several years ago.
And Dmitry, this relationship goes to the most vulnerable, doesn't it? I mean, let's talk about Putin signing a law banning U.S. adoptions of Russian children. It's in response to the Magnitsky Law, which was set up, which helped set up human rights sanctions against Russian officials. I mean, that just shows just how low and petty, again, this relationship is at the moment.
Well, I mean, it's a long story, and I would say that since Putin's return to power last year, the Western media sort of crammed it, crammed it into its head, and it crammed it into the heads of its readers, that Putin is going to be more reactionary than Medvedev, that relations are going to sour. So I'm not sure that this is true, because I don't see any substantial difference between the foreign policy of Medvedev and the foreign policy of Putin.
But there has been a difference, hasn't there, James?
I think
didn't catch your question, sorry.
There was a change in the attitude of the United States, not in the attitude of Russia, because these are the people from the same team. Putin and Medvedev are not very different in their foreign policy approach.
Do you agree with that, James?
I do think there has been a change in the United States, yes. And I would also agree with Dmitry very much so, that Putin's policy doesn't differ very much from Medvedev's policy, because Putin was in control the whole of Medvedev's four-year tenure. So as for Washington changing its tune, yes, I think that is entirely true as well. The fact of the matter is President Obama has taken a lot of stick, a lot of punches from the Russian side. And suddenly he's just thrown one back, a light one, but just a gentle reminder, if you will, not a bad one, but a gentle reminder that actually America isn't to be trifled with that much, and you can't keep kicking it. And I think that suddenly President Obama has found his spine behind the back of a sofa, and decided he'll stand up to them for a change.
Okay,
and I think that's probably on the basis that the previous policy simply wasn't working.
That is affecting Russia and much of the world. Russia is drawing criticism for its treatment of homosexuals. In June, President Putin signed a law banning what the government calls gay propaganda. The law imposes fines on anyone taking part in gay pride demonstrations or anyone making homosexuality seem attractive to minors. The law has triggered outrage across the globe, with some calling for next year's Olympics in Sochi to be cancelled or held elsewhere.
The main goal is to protest, firstly, to protest against politics of our officials, of our president and parliament, against the LGBT community, because they recognize these people as second-class people, and we are not equal in all rights, and we don't have right for assembly, and we don't have a right for a speech.
The governments around the world and the people around the world need to put the pressure on, in spite of if the games go on or not. That's not like the Olympic Games are not the important issue. The issue is the rights of the Russian gay people.
We decided not to sell anymore any products that come from Russia. We don't buy it and we don't sell it.
Government has a responsibility to protect its citizens, and Russia's not upholding its responsibility to its gay citizens, and it's a human rights violation, so that's why we're here.
And Barack Obama has also weighed in on the controversy, saying the best way for gay athletes is to send a message to Russia, which is to win big at the Games next year in Sochi.
I do not think it's appropriate to boycott the Olympics. We've got a bunch of Americans out there who are training hard, who are doing everything they can to succeed. And one of the things I'm really looking forward to is maybe some gay and lesbian athletes bringing home the gold or silver or bronze, which I think would go a long way in rejecting the kind of attitudes that we're seeing there.
Dmitry, what's the problem in Russia? Why the need for this law?
Well, if you allow me to speak for 2 minutes, because last time
No,
you
we don't
cut
have
me
2 minutes,
before I
please.
could explain
Go for
about
it.
adoptions. All right. So this law, which is called anti-gay in the U.S., is actually corrections to a previous law called on protection of children from information that can harm their health and development.
Well, was
These
it a problem
corrections
for
were adopted
homosexuals
in
and
June.
not heterosexuals to pass on that same kind of information?
Well, you promised me that you would give me 2 minutes. You
I didn't
give me
promise you
30
2 minutes, but
seconds.
please go ahead.
This law was adopted in June, and for 2 months almost there were no reactions to it. Then suddenly some clever head in New York or Washington connected the dots, and now they talk about this law in the context of the Olympic Games. This law is about shielding children from explicit homosexual sex. I don't see how it is connected to the Olympic Games. The authors of this law certainly didn't say a word about Olympic Games. The Russian government didn't say a single thing about Olympic Games and this law. In Russia, we have gay clubs, we have gay literature, I have lots of gay friends. None of them is arrested. And I don't think US athletes, when they come to Russia, are going to talk to children about sex. If they don't talk to children about sex, if they don't introduce them to homosexual practices, they are going to be free to do what they want in Russia. Certainly in countries like Qatar, laws on homosexuality are a lot stricter than in Russia.
James, is it fair to say that Russia is a gay-friendly country? That's probably the first time I've heard that.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. The fact of the matter is that Russia is a deeply homophobic country. Yes, I accept the fact that it is not illegal anymore, and I accept the fact that there do indeed exist gay clubs and literature. That is certainly true. But that is very much a minority insofar as the way in which it has been described by more influential Russian politicians is that this has the support of about 98–99% of the population. In other words, Putin will tell you that he is a conservative, and this is simply a reflection of society at large. He is doing his people's will. The irony and the hypocrisy here is that if you take an issue like capital punishment, which also the majority of Russians would support, then they'll say, in fact, they are coming into modern-day society. Of course, I note that America does have capital punishment, unlike most countries in the world, by the way. But as far as Russia is concerned, then they go against the people's will. So in other words, Russia wants to have it both ways here.
Excuse me, jumping in here, of this law has led to calls for a boycott of the Games. We're seeing a vodka ban in many countries in the world, a vodka boycott.
Yes, because other countries have ultimately been freer for longer. Russia is, in a way, 22 years old. That's how long it's been since the collapse of communism, and it was exposed to the outside world. So the attitudes, I suppose, that we had 50 years ago, 60 years ago, are ultimately in Russia present today. We've had that long to acclimatize, if you like, and we've moved on. But Russia's simply behind the times on all of these issues. It'll come, but it's just as the internet, infuses into society more, as there's more cross-cultural interaction, as there's more intermarriage, then ultimately, of any kind, by the way, gay or straight, then ultimately these attitudes will change. But it'll take time in Russia. I'm afraid it's simply just behind the times.
Dmitry, let me give you the final word. In light of this conservatism, this growing isolation of Russia, where do you see relations, particularly between US and Russia, going forward?
Well, I think that relations will improve because, as I said, there is no objective ground for disagreements. We face the same threats. And I agree with James that maybe we are more conservative in the gay issue than, say, Great Britain or France. But Britain had this Amendment 28, which is very much like the law we have been talking about. It had it until recently. So I don't think we are 40 or 50 or 60 years behind. We are much closer. And I think that there is nothing bad about the word conservatism. Great Britain taught us that conservatism is not a swear word. No one knows who is right at the moment, the progressives or the conservatives. So I think that what we have is certainly not a Cold War, it's a misunderstanding. Unfortunately, a misunderstanding fueled by the media. As soon as the media get to their job, reporting things and not making facts fit their scheme about Vlad the Bad, Putin the reactionary, I don't think Putin is ideal. In fact, I don't think he is a Democrat.
Okay, let's leave it there, Dmitry. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. And obviously, it's always easy to blame the media. Let's thank our guests, James Nixie and Dmitry Babic. And, of course, thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We're back on Monday with an all-new discussion. Thanks again for watching. From me, Jane Dutton, and the rest of the team, goodbye.